Inside the Sterling Maritime Tower, my family was carving up an $800 million empire while I stood in the rain with cheap shoes and a soaked folder. They expected a beggar, a failure they could laugh at one last time. But the laughter died the second I tossed that file onto the mahogany table. The lawyer turned pale because he knew what was inside. It wasn't a plea for cash. It was a roadmap to a federal cell. My name is Elena Vance, and as I stood before the looming monolith of glass and steel that was the Sterling Maritime Tower, the Seattle rain felt less like weather and more like a judgment. I gripped the plastic folder in my hand so tightly my knuckles turned white, the cheap material slick against my skin. 10 years of my life were contained in these wet pages. 10 years of optimizing routes, negotiating with unions, and saving this company from its own bloat, all erased because I did not have the correct gender or the requisite lack of morals to lead the family empire. I pushed through the revolving doors, dripping water onto the pristine marble lobby, and made my way to the boardroom. This was not a funeral, though it certainly felt like one. It was a living trust reading, a grotesque ceremony my parents, Marcus and Lydia, had orchestrated to formally hand over the keys to the kingdom while they were still alive to bask in the applause. The air inside the boardroom was thick, suffocating with the scent of cured leather, furniture polish, and 50-year-old single malt scotch. The shareholders and board members sat like vultures in expensive plumage, their eyes flicking over my waterlogged trench coat and muddy shoes with undisguised contempt. My brother, Julian, sat at the head of the table. He looked immaculate in a bespoke Italian suit that likely cost more than I made in 6 months at my current, humiliating job. He swirled his crystal glass and offered me a pitying smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. "You are late, Elena," Julian said, his voice smooth and oily. "Did the bus break down, or did you have to finish a shift moving boxes at that warehouse? It must be exhausting, being the stain of incompetence on our family name." I said nothing. I just took my place at the far end of the table, standing because no chair had been pulled out for me. The family lawyer, a man whose spine had curved from decades of bowing to my father, cleared his throat. He began to read the declaration. The words hung in the air like smoke. Julian was to inherit 100% of the Sterling Maritime shares. He was now the sole owner of an empire valued at $800 million. "And for Elena Vance," the lawyer droned, refusing to look at me. "Marcus and Lydia have preserved a vintage suitcase containing her belongings from her university years. Furthermore, a restraining order has been filed, effective immediately, barring Ms. Vance from coming within 500 feet of any Sterling property." The room remained silent, save for the clink of ice in Julian's glass. I did not scream. I did not cry. Instead, I placed my folder on the table. "Father," I said, my voice steady despite the trembling in my legs. "Before you sign, look at page 4. There is a discrepancy in the fuel surcharges. Julian has been leveraging future assets to cover present liquidity issues. If the market dips even 2%, the company is insolvent." Marcus didn't even look at the file. He looked at me with a sneer that mirrored my brother's. "Always so dramatic. Elena, you are just jealous, paranoid. You cannot stand that Julian is the visionary and you are just the help." Then my mother, Lydia, stood up. She walked over to me, her heels clicking on the hardwood. She didn't hug me. Instead, she slid a piece of paper into my hand. "This is an invoice," she said, her voice devoid of warmth. $15,000 for the piano lessons and etiquette classes we wasted on you. Consider this the final settling of accounts. We are done. Elena, pay it and disappear." Before I could respond, 2 security guards seized my arms. They didn't escort me, they dragged me. I was hauled through the lobby and thrown out the front entrance. I lost my footing on the slick pavement and fell hard into a puddle of freezing mud. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, I could see them, the board members, my parents, Julian. They were raising their glasses. They were laughing. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I wiped the mud from the screen with a trembling hand. It was a text from my landlord. My credit cards, supplementary cards linked to the family trust, which I thought were my own, had been canceled an hour ago. My rent check had bounced. My belongings were currently being placed on the curb. I was officially homeless. I walked for hours until I reached the industrial shipping docks. The wind cut through my wet clothes, biting and cruel. I sat on a rusted bollard, looking out at the dark water where massive container ships sat anchored. Some of them bore the Sterling logo. I realized then that kindness had been my weakness. I had tried to be the good daughter, the diligent worker, the loyal asset. That person died in the mud outside the tower. I looked down at the folder I still clutched in my hand. They thought I was finished. They thought power came from titles and Italian suits. But I knew the truth. Power came from leverage. I wasn't going to scream at them. I was going to calculate their destruction. I would bring their $800 million empire crashing down, and I would do it using the very numbers they were too arrogant to read. The rain had turned into a relentless freezing mist by the time I drifted to the South Industrial District. This was where the city swept its dust, a graveyard of rusted metal and broken dreams far removed from the polished mahogany of the boardroom. I had $7 in my pocket. I spent 5 of them on a stale turkey sandwich from a bodega that smelled of bleach and old grease. It was the only meal I would have for the foreseeable future, and I held it like a treasure. At a dilapidated bus stop, huddled against the biting wind, I saw a commotion. An old man, dressed in layers of mismatched flannel and a coat held together by gray duct tape, was on his knees in the slush. He was scrambling for loose coins he had dropped. 3 teenagers in oversized hoodies were circling him, kicking the coins away and laughing as he crawled. My stomach was cramping with hunger, and my feet were numb, but something inside me snapped. I marched over. I did not scream. I used the voice I used to use on union foremen who were trying to delay a shipment, a tone of absolute, unyielding authority. I told them exactly what the police response time was for this sector and described their appearances with such clinical precision that they realized I was not just a passerby, but a witness who would file a report. They muttered curses and scattered into the alleyways. I helped the man up. He was shaking. I sat him down on the bench and, without thinking, broke my sandwich in half. I gave him the bigger piece. "You are a fool," the old man said, chewing slowly. "You are starving, yet you feed a stranger." "I am already screwed," I said, staring at the gray pavement. "Might as well be screwed with a clear conscience." He stopped chewing and looked at me. His eyes were not the eyes of a senile drifter. They were sharp, assessing, and terrifyingly intelligent. "You are Marcus Sterling's daughter, Elena." I stiffened. "I am no one's daughter." "Good," he said. "Marcus is an idiot. Julian is a parasite. But you are the engine. I know you fixed the Trans-Pacific route efficiency in 2019. I know you saved them 12% in fuel costs last quarter." I stared at him. "Who are you?" "Silas Thorne." The name hit me like a physical blow. Silas Thorne was a ghost story in the shipping world. He was the data tycoon who had rivaled my father for decades before vanishing into obscurity. Legend said he lost his mind, looking at his coat. I believed it, but looking at his eyes, I knew the legend was wrong. "I have been watching you, Elena," Silas said, wiping crumbs from his beard. "I saw them throw you out. I saw them laugh. I need a ghost, and you need a resurrection." He made me an offer right there on the bench. It was work in the shadows, with a basic salary that barely covered rent. But he promised to teach me how to read the invisible lines of the world, the data that never made it into the official ledgers. "Prove it," he said. He pulled a tablet from his rucksack. It was military grade, jarringly modern against his rags. Find the smuggler. There is a container with contraband in the port of Seattle. Sector 4, 50 hectares. You have the raw truck axle weight data. You have 6 hours. I took the tablet. The screen was a waterfall of numbers. Most people saw chaos. I saw music. I ignored the manifests because manifests lie. I looked at the physics. A truck carrying electronics distributes weight differently than one carrying textiles. I cross-referenced the suspension compression data with the declared cargo types. Found it, I said. Silas looked at his watch. It has been 3 hours. It is container number 409, I said, pointing at the screen. Declared as feather pillows? But the rear axle stress suggests high-density shifting mass, liquid, or gold. But the weight distribution is off-center. It is not just contraband. Silas, it is a double-blind load. They are hiding weight within weight. Silas was silent for a long time. Then, a slow, predatory smile spread across his face. I missed that pattern, he admitted softly. Come with me. He led me to an abandoned canning factory a few blocks away. The outside was covered in graffiti, but inside, it was a fortress. Rows of humming servers cooled by industrial fans filled the space. Monitors covered the walls, displaying live feeds of global shipping lanes. This is where we work, Silas said. You want to bring down the Sterling Empire. You do not do it with a lawsuit. You do it by pulling the thread that unravels the sweater. I looked at the screens, seeing my family's ships moving like dots on a map. Where do I sign? No paper. Silas said, You sign with your life. Because Sterling Maritime is not just cooking the books. Elena, I have found anomalies in their thermal scans. They are not just moving cargo. They are moving something dangerous, something that should not exist. And you are going to help me expose it. The next 8 months were not merely a learning curve. They were a descent into hell followed by a reconstruction. Silas did not believe in weekends or sleep. He believed in data. I absorbed international maritime law until I could recite the statutes backward. I learned the intricate, dirty mechanics of laundering money through cryptocurrency, watching digital coins tumble through mixers until they came out clean on the other side. I learned how to hunt down shell companies in Panama, peeling back layers of corporate obfuscation like rotting skins of an onion until the true owner was revealed. My reflection in the warehouse window began to change. The long hair that my mother always insisted I curl was gone, chopped into a sharp, efficient bob that required zero maintenance. The pastel blouses were replaced by black turtlenecks and utility jackets. I stopped walking like a woman apologizing for her existence and started walking like a soldier in enemy territory. The girl who desperately wanted her parents to love her had died in the rain. In her place stood someone far more dangerous. Silas drilled one principle into my skull until it became my religion. Money never disappears, Elena, he would say, tapping his screen with a stained finger. It only changes form. It turns into real estate, into art, into crypto, into debt. Find the form, and the enemy dies. I took his advice and applied it to myself. I ran a forensic audit on my own identity. The results made my blood run cold. There was a loan, a staggering sum of $200,000, taken out in my name at a private bank in Switzerland I had never even visited. The dates of the withdrawal aligned perfectly with a quarter where Julian had lost a fortune on a failed venture in Macau. My parents had not just cast me aside. They had been using my social security number and identity as a financial shield for years. They had leveraged my credit to cover the high-risk loans they took out to patch the holes Julian punched in the company hull. The betrayal did not make me cry. It cauterized my heart. The lingering sadness evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. I opened a new digital file, but this time it was not for defense. I began building a legal dossier designed for a scorched earth offensive to test my new skills in the real world. Silas assigned me to manage a logistics project for a non-governmental organization called Green Harbor. It was a food relief charity, a perfect cover that gave me legitimate access to the docks without raising suspicion. I applied the ruthless efficiency I had once saved for Sterling Maritime. Within 3 months, I had overhauled their distribution network and reduced their overhead costs by 40%. The grizzled dock workers and union foremen, men who usually ignored women in suits, began to nod at me with genuine respect. They saw the results. Then came the day Julian decided to grace the docks with his presence. He spotted me near the loading bay of the Green Harbor warehouse. I was wearing a high-visibility vest and holding a tablet, checking a manifest. He assumed I was a manual laborer, a grunt working for minimum wage. He strode over, his entourage trailing behind him, a smirk plastered on his face. "Look at how far the mighty have fallen," Julian laughed, his voice echoing off the shipping containers. "From the boardroom to the loading dock. Are the boxes too heavy for you? Elena, do you want me to give you $5 for lunch?" He leaned against his silver sports car, which he had parked diagonally across the access ramp for the relief trucks. He looked at me, expecting shame. He expected me to look down. I looked him dead in the eye. "You are parked in a federally mandated emergency relief lane. Julian," I said, my voice calm and projecting clearly over the noise of the cranes. "I own this port," he sneered. "You lease the commercial terminals." I corrected him. Green Harbor operates under a humanitarian charter, according to Section 8, Paragraph 4 of the Port Authority Safety Code. Any unauthorized vehicle blocking a relief lane is subject to immediate seizure. I raised my radio before he could respond. "Control, this is Vance at Pier 6. I have a code red obstruction. License plate Sterling 1. Authorization code Delta Niner. Tow it." Julian turned pale as a heavy-duty tow truck, which I had signaled 2 minutes prior, rumbled around the corner with its lights flashing. For the first time, he realized the sister he bullied was gone. He was looking at a stranger who knew the rules better than he did, and for the first time in his life, his money could not stop the hook from latching onto his bumper. Julian, in his infinite arrogance, thought he had dealt the final blow with an iPhone camera. 2 hours after the tow truck incident, a video appeared on his social media feed. It was a shaky, vertical clip of me lifting a crate of canned beans. Captioned, "From Maritime Princess to Dock Rat, How the Mighty Have Fallen." He tagged every major business news outlet in Seattle. The video went viral overnight, racking up 2 million views. The comments section was initially a cesspool of mockery, filled with people laughing at the heiress who had lost her crown. But Julian had forgotten the one thing I learned in the warehouse data can be weaponized, but so can a narrative. I did not report the video for harassment. I did not delete my accounts. Instead, I shared it. I pinned it to the top of the Green Harbor page with a new caption, proud to do the heavy lifting for those who cannot. Honest work feeds families. What does your inheritance do? Then, I went on the offensive. I published a side-by-side financial transparency report. I showed how Green Harbor, under my logistics management, delivered 90 cents of every dollar directly to the hungry, then using public records. I contrasted it with Sterling Maritime's bloated overhead, where 60 cents of every dollar went to executive bonuses and private jet fuel. The internet loves an underdog, but it loves a receipt even more. The tide turned instantly. The mockery turned into admiration. Donations to Green Harbor skyrocketed. Major philanthropists began reaching out to me, bypassing the Sterling Foundation entirely. The hashtag #RealWork started trending in Seattle, and for the first time in years, people were talking about me not as a Sterling, but as a Vance. While Julian was busy fighting a losing war in the comment sections, I received a secure message on an encrypted channel. It was from a former mid-level manager at Sterling, a man I had once helped with a medical leave issue. The message was short. "Check the manifest for the vessel Obsidian, labeled as medical components. It is not." I brought the tip to Silas. We pulled the satellite telemetry for the Obsidian. The ship was scheduled to dock in 3 days. On the surface, everything looked legitimate. The paperwork claimed it was carrying high-end MRI parts for recycling, but then I looked at the transponder logs. "Look at this gap," I said, tracing the line on the screen. 12 hours of radio silence in the middle of the Pacific. "They turned off the GPS," Silas muttered. Why, I cross-referenced the ship's draft weight before and after the blackout. The ship got lighter, I realized. They dumped something, or they swapped it. I dug into the hazardous material classifications. Sterling Maritime had recently applied for a massive green energy subsidy, claiming they were importing recyclable medical waste to process safely. But the weight discrepancies told a different story. They were not recycling anything. They were loading toxic e-waste lead, mercury, cadmium, shipping it out to international waters, and dumping the worst of it, or selling it to unregulated processing plants in developing nations while claiming full government subsidies for green processing back home. It wasn't drug smuggling. It was environmental fraud on a massive scale. Julian, however, was too blinded by his bruised ego to realize I was dissecting his business model. He only saw the real work hashtag and wanted blood. That night, 3 men in dark clothes broke into the Green Harbor warehouse. They smashed pallets of baby formula. They overturned crates of rice. They spray-painted slurs on the office walls. I was not there, but I was watching. I had spent my first paycheck from Silas on a military-grade security system. I sat in my car 2 blocks away, watching the live feed on my laptop. The high-definition night vision cameras caught every face. The thermal sensors recorded their body heat signatures. I saw them high-five each other after destroying food meant for starving children. My finger hovered over the dial button for the police. I could have had them arrested for vandalism and breaking and entering. But then I stopped. Arresting 3 hired thugs would not hurt Julian. It would be a minor inconvenience. I needed to hurt him properly. I saved the footage to 3 separate secure cloud servers. I did not call the cops. I let them finish and leave. This video was not evidence for a burglary charge. It was the ace of spades for the game I was about to end. I would let Julian think he had won this round. Let him feel safe. Let him get sloppy. Because when I finally played this card, it wasn't going to be for a fine. It was going to be for a prison sentence. The lawsuit arrived via courier in a thick, cream-colored envelope. Sterling Maritime was suing me for $250,000 for disclosure of trade secrets. They claimed my comparison charts regarding the charity logistics utilized proprietary data. My lawyer, a tired man I had found in the yellow pages, begged me to settle or issue a public apology to make it go away. I refused. I told him to accept the penalty and draft the payment wire immediately. He looked at me as if I had lost my mind. He asked if I actually had $250,000. I told him to just send the paperwork. I went to Silas. He did not blink at the sum. He transferred the funds to my holding account. But this money was not normal currency. It was bait. We had tagged the digital packets with a specific hash key, a forensic marker that would act like radioactive dye in the bloodstream of the banking system. I wired the money to Sterling Maritime at 9 a.m. By 9:15, the trap snapped shut. Silas and I watched the monitors in the warehouse, our eyes glued to the flow of data. As we predicted, Marcus did not use the money to cover operational costs or pay the shareholders. The moment the funds cleared the Sterling account, they were wired out immediately to a shell company in the Cayman Islands called Vortex Holdings. We tracked the ledger history of Vortex Holdings in real time. It was not an investment firm. It was a black hole. Vortex was being used to service interest payments on massive, high-risk loans from unregistered lenders. We dug deeper, peeling back the layers of the account. The truth was staggering. Julian had not just mismanaged the company, he had gutted it. He had lost $50 million in a disastrous mix of online gambling and cryptocurrency speculation. To cover his tracks, he was siphoning money directly from the dockworkers' pension fund. But the horror did not stop there. I intercepted internal emails between my parents. Marcus and Lydia were fully aware of the theft. Instead of stopping him, they were actively falsifying dates on the financial reports to make it look like the losses occurred during my tenure as operations director 3 years ago. They were not just protecting their son. They were actively building a narrative to send me to prison for his crimes. I felt sick, but the final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. Later that afternoon, I received a call from a burner phone. It was Julian's fiancée, a quiet woman named Clara who usually stood in his shadow at galas. She asked to meet in a crowded park. When I saw her, she was wearing large sunglasses to hide a bruise on her cheek. She told me that he blamed me for the stress and that he took it out on her. She said she wanted him stopped. She slid a piece of paper across the park bench. It contained the IP address and administrative password to Julian's private home server. Back at the warehouse, I accessed the server. It was a treasure trove of filth. I found the schedules for the ghost ships, vessels that officially did not exist, charted to transport unregistered cargo. But the file that made my heart stop was a folder labeled Insurance Policy. I opened it. Inside were hundreds of bills of lading for toxic waste shipments dating back 5 years. At the bottom of every single document was a signature, my signature. It was a forgery, but a good one. They had been planning this for half a decade. My parents and my brother had been shipping poison across the ocean and signing my name to the documents. I was never the heir. I was never the disappointment. I was the escape plan. I was the sacrificial lamb they had been fattening up for slaughter since the day I graduated college. I stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in my eyes. The last shred of familial guilt evaporated. They wanted a villain, I would give them one. But I would not be the villain of their story. I would be the villain who ended it. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Environmental Protection Agency were finally circling Sterling Maritime, but they were paralyzed by red tape. They had the smoke, but they needed the fire, and in a court of law, digital ledgers were often dismissed as circumstantial. They needed physical evidence. They needed the poison in a jar. That meant someone had to walk into the lion's den and take it, and since I was the only one who knew exactly where the bodies were buried, that someone was me. The target was Terminal 4, the high-security heart of the Sterling operation. We knew a shipment of the so-called ghost cargo was sitting there, waiting for a midnight load onto a Liberian-flagged vessel. Silas had spent 12 hours forging a set of credentials for a senior health inspector that were so perfect they would have fooled the president. I went in during a torrential downpour. The rain was coming down in sheets, turning the dock lights into blurry halos and drowning out the sound of my footsteps. I bypassed the main gate with the badge, but once inside the perimeter, the badge was useless. This area was patrolled by private security contractors, men with assault rifles and very loose rules of engagement. I moved through the shadows of the cranes, dodging the sweeping beams of flashlights. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I found the container stack in the far corner of the yard. The manifest claimed the box contained industrial water filtration units. I used a bolt cutter to snap the seal and cracked the heavy steel doors just enough to slip inside. The smell hit me instantly. It was the sharp, metallic tang of battery acid mixed with the sweet, rotting scent of ozone. I clicked on my pen light. There were no water filters. The container was packed floor to ceiling with cracked lead-acid car batteries and decaying server motherboards, all leaking a viscous neon green fluid onto the floor. This was highly toxic e-waste, illegal to export under every international treaty in existence. I pulled out a glass vial and scooped up a sample of the leaking sludge. Then I raised my camera and snapped 3 rapid-fire photos of the serial numbers and the cargo. I was too focused on the lens. As I stepped back to get a wider angle, my boot broke the beam of a laser motion sensor hidden near the door. A red light flashed. Then, a siren screamed into the night, shattering the silence. Breach in Sector 4. A voice boomed over the loudspeakers. I scrambled out of the container just as a spotlight swept over the metal doors. I didn't look back. I ran. I could hear heavy boots splashing in the puddles behind me and the racking of slides on rifles. I sprinted into the maze of stacked containers. A guard yelled for me to stop, but I took a sharp left, then a hard right. I knew this grid. I had designed the optimization layout for this very yard 3 years ago. I knew that row G ended in a dead end, but row H had a narrow gap between the reefer units that a large man in tactical gear could not fit through. I squeezed through the gap, the cold steel scraping my jacket. I sprinted toward the perimeter fence where Silas was waiting. I threw my bag over the razor wire and began to climb. My foot slipped on the wet chain link, and a barb sliced deep into my calf, but I didn't feel the pain. I felt only the adrenaline. I vaulted over the top and landed hard on the asphalt on the other side. A black van screeched out of the darkness. The side door slid open, and Silas yelled for me to get in. I dove inside just as bullets sparked against the pavement where I had been standing a second before. Silas floored the accelerator, and we vanished into the rainy night. Back at the warehouse, while Silas bandaged my bleeding leg, we ran the sample through a mass spectrometer. The results were terrifying. The lead and cadmium levels were 500% higher than the threshold for lethal toxicity. This was enough poison to kill a small town's water supply. It was enough evidence to bury my parents and Julian in a federal prison for the rest of their lives. But I did not call the FBI, not yet. That would be too quick. Instead, I took the lab report and the photos, redacted my source, and sent them anonymously to the global insurance conglomerate that underwrote Sterling Maritime's liability policies. 10 minutes later, I received a notification on my tablet. The risk algorithm for Sterling Maritime had just updated. Their insurance premiums didn't just rise, they exploded, increasing by 400% in a single instant. The first domino had fallen. Now, I would watch them panic. The collapse of Sterling Maritime did not happen with a bang, but with the suffocating silence of a frozen bank account. The insurance premiums had spiked by 400% overnight, triggering automatic default clauses in their loan agreements. The major banks, sensing blood in the water, immediately froze their credit lines. The empire was not just bleeding, it was hemorrhaging. Julian handled the crisis with the emotional maturity of a toddler. He began liquidating personal assets in a panic, selling his sports cars for pennies on the dollar. But it was not enough. In a desperate bid to save cash, he fired 300 dock workers via email on a Tuesday morning. By noon, there was a riot at the company gates. Burning tires and picket lines blocked the entrance, and the smoke drifted all the way to the penthouse offices. That was when my phone rang. It was my mother, Lydia. Her voice, usually dripping with disdain, was trembling. She did not threaten me. She did not demand. She begged. She asked me to come home for a family dinner. I agreed to go. I did not go to eat. I taped a slim, high-fidelity recorder to the inside of my blazer. I wanted to hear the sound of their desperation. The Sterling estate was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos I knew was unfolding at the port. The servants were gone, likely let go or quit when the paychecks bounced. We sat at the long dining table, the three of them looking like ghosts in their designer clothes. Marcus poured wine with a shaking hand. They skipped the small talk. "Elena," my father started, forcing a smile that looked like a grimace. "We know we have had our differences, but family is about forgiveness. We are in a temporary bind. A liquidity issue. Nothing serious." "Nothing serious?" I asked, cutting a piece of dry chicken. "Your workers are burning effigies of Julian at the main gate." "They are peasants," Lydia dismissed with a wave of her hand. "Here is the situation. We know you have done wonders with Green Harbor. You have excellent credit there. We need you to take out a bridge loan under the charity's name. Just $5 million. We will pay it back in a month with double interest. It is just a formality to calm the banks." I stopped eating. I looked at them. Even now, with the walls falling in, they thought I was stupid. They wanted me to embezzle funds from a humanitarian organization to bail out their sinking ship. "You want me to launder money through a nonprofit," I said flatly. "You want me to commit federal fraud to save a company that you stole from me." "It is not fraud," Julian snapped, slamming his hand on the table. "It is business." "You ungrateful little—" "I know about the ghost ships," I said, my voice barely a whisper, yet it silenced the room instantly. "And I know about the manifests from 5 years ago, the ones carrying toxic waste, the ones signed by Elena Vance." The color drained from Marcus's face. You are imagining things." "Am I?" I reached into my bag. "I have the forensic handwriting analysis. You forged my signature. You planned to frame me the moment the EPA started asking questions. You never loved me. I was just your insurance policy," Julian screamed, a raw, animalistic sound of rage. He lunged across the table, grabbing for my throat, but I was not the scared girl he used to shove into lockers. I sidestepped his clumsy attack, grabbed his wrist, and used the momentum to twist his arm behind his back, slamming his face into the mahogany table. I held him there, listening to him whimper. "Sit down, Julian," I said, releasing him. He slumped back into his chair, rubbing his shoulder, staring at me in shock. I stood up and smoothed my jacket. I tossed a thick envelope onto the table. "I am not giving you a loan," I said. "This is a court summons. I am suing you for the fraudulent $200,000 debt you took out in my name. The hearing is next week. I suggest you find a lawyer who accepts payment in used furniture." I walked to the door. Before I left, I looked back. Marcus was staring at me, his mouth slightly open. For the first time in my life, I did not see disappointment in his eyes. I saw terror. They finally realized that the sheep they had kicked for years had grown fangs, and she was done grazing. The deadline for the Sterling Maritime loans was approaching like a runaway train. The banks had set a hard date of Friday for the foreclosure of the main assets, meaning my family had exactly 72 hours to come up with $10 million in liquid cash to stay afloat. It was a mathematical impossibility through legal channels, which meant they had to turn to the only option they had left. They had to bring in one final, massive shipment of the special cargo. Silas and I were waiting for this. We had tapped into the encrypted comms of the vessel 3 days prior. We knew the name of the ship, the Poseidon's Wrath, and we knew exactly which berth it was assigned to at midnight. I sat at the head of a steel table in a secure briefing room with the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Coast Guard. This time, my folder was not wet, and my shoes were dry. I opened the file and laid out the anatomy of a crime in excruciating detail. I showed them the flow of funds to Vortex Holdings. I presented the forensic analysis of the forged signatures that proved my parents had been framing me for half a decade. Finally, I placed the toxicology report from the sample I had stolen on the table. "Say, this is not just fraud," I told the lead agent, a stern woman named Miller. "This is environmental terrorism for profit. But if you intercept the ship at sea, they will claim ignorance. They will say it was a supplier error. You need to let it dock. You need to let Julian sign for it. You need to catch them with their hands in the poison." Agent Miller looked at the file, then at me. She nodded. We wait for the offload. Meanwhile, my father was making his final move. Desperate to cover the upfront insurance guarantee for this black market shipment, Marcus had drained the last of the family's legitimate accounts. He liquidated the remaining bonds and even put the deed to the Sterling estate up as collateral. He was pushing all his chips into the center of the table, betting everything on one hand of cards that I had already rigged. Julian, driven by a mix of paranoia and greed, decided he could not trust a middleman. He was going to oversee the offload personally. He wanted to ensure not a single dollar was skimmed off the top. I watched it all unfold from the Port Authority control tower, standing in the dark with a pair of binoculars. Below me, the port was a silent grid of shadows and sodium lights. I saw Julian's car pull up to the pier. He looked small from this height, just a nervous figure pacing back and forth in the rain. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a message from Lydia. Even at the end, she tried to bargain with things she did not possess. Please. Elena, the text read, I know you have pull at the port. Call off the inspectors. Save your brother, and I will restore your honor. I will tell everyone it was a mistake. You can be a Sterling again. I stared at the screen, feeling a profound sense of detachment. She still thought honor was a currency she could print and distribute. She still thought being a Sterling was a prize. I typed my reply slowly. Honor is not something you can give or take back. Mother. It is something I build myself, and I am done building yours. I pressed send and turned off the phone. Out in the harbor, a dark shape detached itself from the fog. The Poseidon's Wrath drifted toward the dock, its engines thrumming low and deep. It was a leviathan of rust and steel, carrying enough toxic waste to poison the entire coastline. The massive port cranes began to move, their gears grinding as they prepared to lower the hook. I watched the first container lift into the air, swinging gently as it descended toward the American soil. The trap was not just set, it was springing shut. The moment the steel container touched the asphalt of the pier, the trap snapped shut with the force of a guillotine. The darkness of the harbor was instantly shattered by the blinding white beams of floodlights from 3 circling helicopters. The air erupted with the deafening wail of sirens and the thumping of rotors. From the shadows of the stacked crates, dozens of federal agents in tactical gear swarmed the landing zone, their weapons drawn and voices screaming commands that echoed off the hull of the ship. Julian froze. He was standing there with a pen in his hand, hovering over the bill of lading, the ink barely dry on his signature. He looked up, blinded by the lights, his face a mask of absolute confusion. Before he could even drop the clipboard, 2 agents were on him, kicking his legs out from under him and slamming him face first into the wet concrete. The Coast Guard cutters moved in from the bay, boxing in the Poseidon's Wrath with mounted machine guns trained on the bridge, miles away, in the drawing room of the Sterling estate. Marcus and Lydia were watching the 10 o'clock news. Their faces went slack as the live feed switched to the breaking story at the port, showing their son being hauled off the ground in handcuffs. But the horror on the screen was quickly replaced by the horror at their front door. A battering ram smashed through the oak entrance, and a tactical team flooded the foyer. They did not knock. They did not ask politely. They threw Marcus against the wall, reading him his rights for money laundering, wire fraud, and conspiracy to traffic hazardous materials. The empire had taken a century to build, and it took exactly 4 minutes to crumble on live television. I walked out from the control tower and made my way to the holding area on the dock. My lawyer walked beside me. Julian was being shoved toward a black SUV, his expensive suit ruined by oil and mud. When he saw me, he stopped struggling. "You!" he screamed, straining against the cuffs. "You did this. You planted it. I will sue you for everything." I didn't shout back. I simply held up a tablet playing a video. It was the high-definition night vision footage of him and his thugs destroying the baby formula at the Green Harbor warehouse. "Add domestic terrorism and destruction of relief supplies to the charge sheet," I told the agent beside him. "We have the timestamp and facial recognition." The family lawyer, the same man who had read the declaration of my disinheritance with such smug satisfaction months ago, came running toward us, breathless and sweating. He started to bluster about entrapment and improper procedure. But then he stopped. He saw the folder in my hand. It was not the wet plastic one from that rainy day. It was thick, bound in leather, and marked with the seal of the Department of Justice. He looked at the folder, then at me, and all the color drained from his face. He turned around and walked away without saying a word. He knew there was nothing to defend. The finale took place in the interrogation rooms of the federal building. I stood behind the one-way glass, watching the feed from two separate rooms. In the first room, I had the agents show Marcus the bank records proving Julian had not just lost the company money, but had embezzled the entirety of their private retirement accounts to pay off his gambling debts. Marcus and Lydia were not just arrested, they were destitute. In the second room, the agents told Julian that his parents were negotiating a plea deal that pinned the entire operation on him as a rogue CEO. The illusion of family loyalty disintegrated instantly. Julian started screaming that it was all Marcus's idea, that his mother had forged the documents, that he was just following orders. In the other room, Marcus was shouting that his son was a thief and a liar who acted alone. They were tearing each other apart like starving rats in a cage. I watched them scream and weep, blaming everyone but themselves. I felt a strange lightness in my chest. I realized then that I had not destroyed the Sterling family. I had simply turned on the lights. Their greed and their lies were what destroyed them. I turned away from the glass and walked out of the observation room, leaving them to the justice they had spent a lifetime avoiding. The wheels of justice turned with a speed that surprised even me. The sheer volume of evidence I had compiled left no room for the high-priced defense attorneys to maneuver. There were no loopholes for environmental terrorism and systematic fraud. 3 months after the raid on the docks, the gavel fell in the federal courthouse. Marcus and Lydia were sentenced to 15 years in prison for money laundering and conspiracy. Julian, bearing the additional weight of trafficking hazardous materials and the destruction of relief supplies, received 20 years without the possibility of parole. The Sterling Empire was dismantled piece by piece. Every ship, every warehouse, and every square inch of real estate was seized by the government and auctioned off. The proceeds were legally earmarked to pay for the massive environmental cleanup operation and to provide severance packages for the thousands of workers my family had betrayed. The judge also issued a formal decree regarding my personal finances. The $200,000 debt was declared void, and my credit history was scrubbed clean, restored to the pristine state it was before my parents stole my identity. I did not walk away from the ashes empty-handed. Using the legitimate earnings from my work with Green Harbor and a silent investment from Silas, I attended the asset auction. I did not bid on the glass tower or the mansion. Instead, I bought a small, neglected section of the commercial dock, the very place where I had first met Silas in the rain. I tore down the old signage and renamed it Vance Logistics. It was going to be a company built on transparency, efficiency, and the radical idea that you can make a profit without poisoning the ocean. I met Silas one last time at our usual bench near the bus stop. He looked cleaner, though he still wore his trademark mismatched coat. He handed me a small, encrypted hard drive. He told me he was retiring for real this time and that the data network he had built was mine to command. He said I had not just passed his course, but I had rewritten the syllabus on how to weaponize the truth. Before I could truly move forward, I had one final obligation. I went to the federal detention center to see my parents. Seeing them in orange jumpsuits, stripped of their Italian silks and their 50-year-old whiskey, was a jarring sight. They did not maintain their dignity. They wept. They screamed. They blamed me for their downfall. And then, in the same breath, they begged me to use my new connections to fund an appeal. I watched them unravel, waiting for a surge of triumph or perhaps a pang of lingering guilt. I felt neither. I felt only a vast, peaceful silence. I leaned forward and spoke into the microphone on the glass partition. I told them that I did not hate them. I explained that hate takes energy, and I had none left to waste on them. I told them I just felt sorry that they loved their money more than they ever loved their children. I hung up the phone and walked away, leaving them to the silence of their cells. I returned to the Green Harbor warehouse, which had doubled in size under my management. A convoy of trucks was rolling out, carrying food and medicine to communities that needed them. I stepped out of the office and stood under the rare, golden sunshine of a Seattle afternoon. I looked down at my hands. I was no longer clutching a wet plastic folder filled with evidence of my pain. In my hand, I held a blueprint for a new terminal, a plan for a future that belonged entirely to me. I took a deep breath of the salt air. It tasted like freedom. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please leave a comment down below and let's chat. If you enjoyed seeing justice served, please subscribe to the channel Lily Revenge Stories. Hit that like button and give us a hype to help this story reach even more people.